Now that we have set up Linux virtual machine, let's actually take a look at how Linux works, and we'll start by learning about Linux file system. Something that I briefly mentioned previously, but we'll go into more detail in this video. First of all, Linux file system is a hierarchical tree structure. We have the root folder, just like tree root, and inside the root folder we have a couple of folders which each has its purpose. And inside those folders we have other folders and files, and the hierarchy just goes on like that. In comparison, the Windows file system does not have one root folder where all the folders stem from, but rather it has multiple root folders. So at root we have disks or drives. This is from the early times actually, when PCs only used insertable floppy disks. So Windows used letters to assign drives for each insertable disk. So A and B, for example, were removable disks. So something that you would insert and then take out again. And when hard drive was added to the PCs, the next letter, which was C, actually became the letter for the internal disk or hard drive. And after that, all the additional disks were given the next available letter. And it basically stayed mostly the same to this day. So that's how file system works in Windows compared to Linux. So now let's actually look at the Linux file system in Linux itself. First of all, in operating systems with graphical user interface, we always have this graphical file system view, right? So this file explorer program that basically shows us the folders and files and all these in a graphical user interface so that we can navigate them easily. And when I open that program, by default, I'm inside the home directory of my user, the user that I am actually logged in with, which is called Nana, right? This is the user that we created. So every user on Linux will get its own folder, basically own space inside the home directory. And this is where I'm at, and there are some default directories that are created for each user, and you see the list of them right here. We have the desktop folder, documents, downloads, etc. Now, this is actually one of the folders in the root of the file system. So how do we actually get to the root folder instead of being in our home directory? If I click on other locations here and computer and click on it, you see that now I'm actually inside the root directory, right? So I'm inside the computer root. And inside the root folder, you see a home directory. And this is basically where all Linux user spaces are located. So each user will have its own space in the home directory, except for the root user, which actually has its own isolated folder separate from all other users. And that is the root directory right here. So this is the home directory for a root user, and this is the home directory for all other users. So let's click inside that home directory, and you see that I have a directory, a folder for my user with the username. And if I click inside, you see that I go back to my default location, right? This is basically my user's home space. So this is one of the most important folder locations basically you have to know in Linux. And it works pretty similar on other operating systems where every user basically has their own space. And it's important to isolate them because most of the operating systems, most of the computers actually support multi-user on their systems, right? So if you have multiple users on your computer, obviously you don't want to mess with each other's programs or settings or whatever. So each user can have their own personal configuration for browser, configuration for maybe an editor, maybe programs that only that user wants to use, and so on. And all of that happens in that user's home directory. However, in addition to the programs and files that only your user needs to see, there are also programs that has to be available system-wide. System-wide basically means installed on a computer which is automatically available to all the users, right? So they're not in a home directory of your user, they are basically available on the outer level, so outside the home directory, and available for all the users of your computer. And this could be applications or also commands, Linux commands that are available on the whole system and for all the users. So where are those actually located? Again, going back to the root on our computer, you see that we have a bunch of other folders here in addition to home. And let's actually start with folder bin, which stands for binary. So if I click inside, so bin folder inside the root directory contains the most basic commands you have available on your operating system. Some of these commands are, for example, cat, which basically shows you the contents of a file. You also have cp, which basically copies a file, echo, and so on. So basically all these basic commands that you use in Linux, they are all located, or the binary files for those commands are all located in this bin directory. And that means that they're available system-wide for all the users, but also to the system itself. Now, what is binary exactly? Binary is simply a format that computer understands. So instead of text, binary values are represented in zeros and ones. And that's what a computer can interpret. So to execute a command, it must be in a binary format, so a computer can actually understand that command. And that's why all these commands that we use on a command line are in binary files. And that's why they're in a folder called bin, which stands for binary. And we're going to actually go through those basic commands in more detail in the next section. Now going back to the root, we have another folder which is called sbin, right? So these are binaries, but for different commands. These are system binaries. Again, if I click inside, you will see a bunch of other commands. And the difference between the two is actually that these commands are system relevant, that these commands actually need a super user permission to execute them. Some of the commands are, as you see, add user, so adding users, also setting passwords for those users, or changing passwords, doing network configuration with IP tables, etc. So all these commands that you see here need super user privilege, so you can't actually execute them with a normal user. So the system bin commands would be used by administrators to administer the system, but also by the system itself to run some commands. And again, we will see how to execute commands with a super user privilege in the next section. And we also have these lib or library folders, which basically hold the libraries for those binaries or for those commands, right? Because they're just the executables, but if they need a library to do something else, those libraries are actually located here. So one program can actually be split into different locations, having the executable files here and having the libraries here, or the same way having the executable binary files here and having the libraries here. And that's kind of a common way of splitting the location of a program when you install them on Linux. Now let's actually go to a folder called USR, which stands for user originally. So this folder was actually the user location before home directory was added. And if you look inside the user folder, we actually see, again, a bunch of folders. However, we have binary folder here as well, S binary or system binary folder as well, and library or library folders. So the same concept as we saw on the root level, but inside the user folder. So what is this about? And if I click inside, you will actually see the same commands that we saw in the binary and the root folder here as well. So we have the package manager command, the apt, for example, cat command, copy command, echo, and so on. So basically the same commands that we saw in the root folder's binary folder. So what's going on here? Basically, this is also a binary folder for all those commands. In the same way, if we look inside the sbin, we would see those administrator commands here, right? And they have their libraries basically located here. And that actually has a historical reason of how this was designed originally in Unix. So basically, because of the limitations of a storage, the split was made to store some of the binaries in the root folder binary or system binary folders and the rest of them in the user folder. And the limitation was, of course, because back in the time the storages were much more limited in size. However, since that limitation actually doesn't exist anymore, now we have those binary files actually duplicated in those two places. So the split doesn't make sense anymore. However, the concept still remains from the old times. And that's why we have these duplicated binaries basically till now. And be aware that when we execute those commands, ls and copy and some basic commands, whenever we execute them on a terminal, they are usually executed from the user bin folder. Another difference between those two locations are that on some operating systems, the outer level bin and sbin folders actually contain less number of commands. So they basically have just a handful of commands inside, and then the user folder bin and sbin would have much more commands. So just be aware that those two are very similar. So you have the system-wide essential commands basically located in those two places. Now inside the user folder, there is another folder called local. And this local folder also has bin, sbin, and lib folders plus some other stuff. And here the differentiation is actually pretty clear because this is a location where the applications that you as a Linux user are installing yourself will actually go. So that's where third-party applications that you install on the system will be located. For example, this could be Docker, Docker Compose, Minikube, Java, Python, whatever. So these extra applications that you installed on your system will go here. And that's why it's called local. And again, as I said, the application installation will be split into these different folders. So if you're installing Java, for example, the binary files of Java commands will go here, the libraries will go here, the documentation will go somewhere else, configuration in another folder, and so on. And we're going to actually install some applications like Java and Docker, etc. on Linux, and we're going to see that the installer or the package manager tool that we're going to use to install that will automatically put the program files in these locations. And note again that the user folder is actually inside the root. So everything that you install here in this local folder will be available for all the users on your computer. So these are going to be system-wide application installations. So if you install Docker here, every user on your computer will actually have Docker available in their home space, right? So they will be able to use Docker. And same goes for Java. However, on Linux, you can actually install applications only for your user, which makes sense because maybe only you're interested in having Docker and other users on the same computer do not actually need Docker. So in that case, you would install it in your user's home directory. Now, there is another location in Linux where the third-party or external applications will be installed, and that is this optional folder. And if I click inside, first of all, you see it's empty because we haven't installed any applications yet. We're just starting from an empty Linux installation. So this folder is empty, as well as user local bin folder, right? We haven't installed any external applications yet, so both of these locations are empty. So what is the difference between this opt directory and user local directory? The difference is that there are actually some applications that do not split their code or their files in different directories, like having the binaries in the bin folder, libraries in the lib folder, etc. These programs would install everything in one directory. And because of that, there is this opt or optional folder where such applications will be installed. An example of such an application would be most of the IDEs, which are basically code editors, right, for different programming languages. So that would be actually installed in /opt, where everything will be in one folder. The binaries, libraries, documentation, shared files, etc. This could also be, for example, web browsers that you install, and so on. So that is a dedicated location for those type of applications. Again, whatever you install here will be system-wide available for all the users. So these are basically the most essential or most important directories in Linux file system, but we also have some other ones that are also interesting. So let's go through them very quickly. First of all, we have this boot directory, which is basically for booting the system. And that means that we should never touch that. This is actually a folder where we as users never do anything, right? This is exclusively for the system itself. And at this point, I want to mention that all the folders that I showed you till now are actually read-only folders, right? So when an application is installed, for example, it will go in this opt or user local directory once, so everything will be installed once. And after that, there will be read-only, right? You don't change the binary files, you don't change the libraries, etc. However, there is a location in the root directory where the system configuration is stored. This would be network interface configuration, etc. This could be the Linux user data and their passwords. So basically things that are writable, not only read-only, but we can change them. And this configuration is located in this etc or etc folder. Originally it was for etc, meaning everything else which was not here, but it actually emerged into being the main configuration location for different applications, as I said, for users, groups, network configuration, etc. So for example, here you see MySQL. So we have the MySQL configuration here. We have Python configuration and a bunch of other .conf or configuration files for other applications. So all of them are located in one place, which is etc. Another folder which is interesting is dev folder, which actually stands for device or devices. And this is where the devices that are connected to your computer will actually be stored. So mouse, keyboard, monitor, external devices that you connect to your computer like USBs, etc. or the hard drive, they would all be in this dev location. So all the files that system needs to interact with this hardware basically will be here. When the operating system starts, it actually logs some data. And these logs are actually stored in a folder called var inside the log folder. And that means if something went wrong or you want to see your system logs, basically, they're all located here. We also have cache, so basically all the cache data from your applications will be stored here. And generally this var folder is for storing logs from different processes that are running on your computer. We also have a temp directory that basically stores some temporary files for different applications. So for example, if an application in the background is doing some process and it needs to temporarily save the data, it will be written here. and at some point they will be then deleted. We also have media and mount folders. So media is basically where your external media is mounted into. External hard drive, maybe a network drive or USB. When you plug that into your computer, that will be automatically in the background actually mounted into this media folder, and they will also be referenced in the devices folder. And for manually mounting, for example, file systems to your operating system, you have this mount folder. So as I said, this happens automatically, but if you want to manually mount, for example, a file system to your operating system, then you can use the mount folder for that. Now, one thing to note here is that usually you will not be interacting with these folders, right? When you install applications using a package manager tool or installer or whatever, and when you interact with your operating system, you will not be directly updating this stuff here. Instead, the application installer or package manager tool or the operating system itself will be actually updating the folders here, right? So as I said, if you plug in a USB, basically, it will automatically be mounted in your system, and then you will see basically the folders or files on that USB without you having to mount anything manually here. And the same way, when you change configuration in your system, they will automatically be updated in this configuration location in the etc, etc. And when you install an application, the package manager tool, for example, which you used, will handle putting the right files into right locations. It will track where everything is going. So when you remove the package or application, it basically cleans up everything and it removes those files from all the different locations. So you don't have to actually do anything manually here. But if you're debugging or troubleshooting, it's actually good to know where things are located so you know where to look for them. And finally, an important concept related to file system is something called hidden files. To show you what that is, let's head back to our user's home directory. And you see here we have a couple of folders. Well, actually, there are some other files and folders right here in this home directory of my user that you don't see by default. And to see them, we can actually go here in the settings options and check show hidden files, and you see those hidden files and folders displayed here. So what are these? The hidden files and folders are usually automatically generated by different applications, and they all start with a dot. And that's why in Unix operating systems, the hidden files are also called dot files. And different applications will automatically create them to store configuration, some scripts they need to execute, etc. For example, right here you see a .mozilla folder for the Mozilla Firefox browser, right? So here, Firefox browser will actually store some configuration options as well as maybe application logs and generally data that that application would need. In addition to applications themselves generating these folders and files, you also have operating system itself generating some of these folders and files specifically for your user. Again, we are in one specific user's home directory, and these are actually some of the files that hold the configuration for your user. So if you have some user preferences that you've configured in your operating system only for your user, they will be stored here. So you have this profile for a user, you have cache where applications that you use in your user space will store some cache data. You have configuration from different applications and operating system, again specific to your user, and this way every user can basically configure the operating system to their needs and have their own preferences without interfering with each other, and they will be all stored right here. So the difference is basically that these are automatically created files and folders either by the operating system or applications where you don't usually modify some stuff. And the main purpose of hiding these files by default is basically to have a cleaner overview when you're displaying your folders, so you don't see a bunch of automatically generated files and folders in each directory. So basically it's just for a cleaner visual display of directories. And you have hidden folders in all operating systems, and they use them in the same way. So Windows has them, macOS has them, and obviously Linux distributions have them. And we're gonna actually see the actual usage of some of those hidden files and folders in the next sections. And you as a user could also actually create hidden folders and files if you needed to. So when creating a folder or file, you just have to prepend dot and then basically name of the file or folder. Let's just call it test. And you just get a note here that it's going to be a hidden folder, create, and now if we hide them again, you don't see it here. And we're going to see some specific cases where you would create a hidden file, but as I said, mostly they're automatically generated by a program or operating system itself.